Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, wherever you are in the world, whether resting in your room, drifting in a quiet place, or settling down after a long day, we'll journey together into the life of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan who ruled at the height of Ottoman splendor. If you truly enjoy these calm history stories, I would love if you pressed the like button and subscribed, but only if you truly enjoy them. It would mean the world to me. In the year 1494 of the Christian calendar, in the month of November, when the autumn rains swept across the Anatolian plateau and the first snows began to gather on the distant peaks of the Taurus Mountains, a child was born in the palace of Trabzon, on the shores of the Black Sea, where the mountains meet the water in a union of stone and foam. This was a place of extraordinary beauty, where Byzantine emperors had once held court in exile, where Greek and Turkish cultures had mingled for centuries, creating something unique and precious that belonged fully to neither tradition alone. The boy who entered the world on that rain-swept November evening was named Suleiman, after the great prophet king Solomon of ancient Israel, whose wisdom and justice had become legendary throughout the ages. His father, Selim, was then a prince serving as governor of Trabzon, a man of fierce energy and ambition whose destiny would eventually carry him to the throne of the greatest empire on earth. His mother, Hafsa Sultan, was a woman of intelligence and strength, whose influence on her son would shape not just his character, but the entire direction of Ottoman politics for generations to come. The world into which young Suleiman was born was one of extraordinary transformation and possibility, where the old medieval order was giving way to something new and unprecedented in human history. The Ottoman Empire, which had begun as a small frontier principality in northwestern Anatolia barely 2 centuries before, had grown with remarkable speed into a major power that controlled the strategic crossroads between Europe and Asia, between the Christian and Islamic worlds, between the settled civilizations of the Mediterranean and the nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes. Constantinople, that ancient city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the capital of the Byzantine Empire, had fallen to Suleiman's great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror, in 1453, just 41 years before the young prince's birth. The transformation of that Christian metropolis into Istanbul, the new Ottoman capital, was still ongoing, as mosques rose where churches had stood, as Turkish settlers mingled with Greek inhabitants, as the city that had once been the heart of Eastern Christianity became the beating center of a new Islamic empire. But the Ottoman realm was not simply a Muslim state imposing its will on conquered Christian populations. It was something far more complex and interesting, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that governed vast populations of Greeks and Armenians, Serbs and Bulgarians, Arabs and Kurds, Jews and Christians of a dozen different denominations, all living under a system that was remarkably tolerant by the standards of the age. The millet system, which allowed different religious communities to govern their own internal affairs according to their own laws and customs, created a form of diversity management that would be studied and sometimes envied by European observers for centuries to come. Young Suleiman's early years in Trabzon were spent in the kind of careful education that the Ottoman dynasty reserved for its princes, a rigorous program designed to prepare potential heirs for the enormous responsibilities they might someday bear. He learned to read and write not just Turkish, but Arabic and Persian as well, the three languages that together formed the linguistic universe of educated Muslims in his world. He memorized substantial portions of the Quran, studied the hadith that recorded the Prophet's sayings and practices, and absorbed the principles of Islamic law that would govern his empire's legal system. But his education extended far beyond religious studies, encompassing the full range of knowledge that a Renaissance prince was expected to master. He studied history, learning about the great empires of the past and the reasons for their rise and fall. He absorbed poetry, both the classical Persian masters and the newer Turkish poets who were creating a distinctive Ottoman literary tradition. He learned mathematics and astronomy, geography and natural philosophy, all the sciences that educated men of his age considered essential to understanding the world and one's place within it. Most importantly, he learned the arts of war and governance, the practical skills that would determine whether he could hold power once he achieved it. He trained with sword and bow, lance and mace, becoming proficient in all the weapons that Ottoman warriors were expected to master. He learned to ride in the demanding style of the steppe nomads from whom the Turks had descended, able to control his mount with his knees while leaving his hands free for weapons. He studied the principles of military strategy and tactics, learning how to read terrain, how to coordinate the movements of different types of troops, how to maintain supply lines across vast distances. The education of an Ottoman prince also included extensive exposure to the practical realities of government administration, as young Suleiman accompanied his father on inspections of the province, sat in on meetings with local officials and tribal leaders, observed the collection of taxes and the administration of justice. These experiences gave him a practical understanding of how the empire actually functioned at the local level, knowledge that would prove invaluable when he eventually assumed supreme authority. The calm routine of Suleiman's education in Trabzon was interrupted when his father Selim was appointed governor of more important provinces, requiring the family to move to new cities and adapt to new circumstances. Each of these moves exposed young Suleiman to different aspects of the empire's diversity, as he observed how Ottoman governance adapted to the needs of different populations and regions. The experience of growing up as a governor's son in various provincial capitals provided him with a breadth of understanding that would distinguish his later rule from that of sultans who had spent their entire youth confined to the palace in Istanbul. In 1509, when Suleiman was 15 years old, his grandfather Bayezid II appointed him governor of Kafa, the ancient Genoese trading city on the Crimean Peninsula that had recently come under Ottoman control. This was an extraordinary honor for one so young, a sign that the Sultan recognized special qualities in his grandson that marked him as a potential future ruler. The appointment also served a practical purpose, as Kafa was an important commercial center whose revenues contributed significantly to the imperial treasury and whose strategic position on the Black Sea made it a key link in the empire's defenses against potential threats from the north. The years Suleiman spent as governor of Kafa were formative ones, providing him with his first experience of independent command and allowing him to develop the administrative skills that would later characterize his reign. He learned to manage the complex relationships between the city's Turkish, Greek, Armenian, and Italian populations, each with their own customs and interests that had to be balanced against the needs of the empire as a whole. He gained first-hand experience with the realities of maritime commerce, understanding how the flow of goods through Black Sea ports connected the Ottoman Empire to markets stretching from Western Europe to Central Asia. But perhaps most importantly, his time in Kafa taught Suleiman the arts of practical diplomacy, as he navigated relationships with the Crimean Tatars, who controlled much of the surrounding territory, with Italian merchants whose expertise was essential to the city's prosperity, and with the various local notables whose cooperation was necessary for effective governance. These experiences taught him that successful rule required not just the exercise of authority, but the cultivation of relationships, the patient building of networks of mutual interest that could make the exercise of power less costly and more effective. The death of Sultan Bayezid II in 1512 and the succession of Suleiman's father Selim I marked the beginning of a new and more turbulent phase in Ottoman history. Selim, who would become known as Yavuz, the Grim, was a man of extraordinary energy and ruthless determination, whose reign, though brief, would transform the empire in fundamental ways. In just 8 years on the throne, he would conquer Syria, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, making the Ottoman Sultan the protector of the most sacred sites in Islam and establishing Ottoman control over the trade routes that connected Europe with the Indies. For young Suleiman, now serving as governor of Sarukan in western Anatolia, his father's accession to the throne meant both increased prominence and increased danger. The Ottoman system of succession had always been brutal, based on the principle that the throne belonged to whichever member of the dynasty could seize and hold it, regardless of birth order or prior designation. Brothers frequently fought brothers for the sultanate, and the victor typically executed his defeated rivals to prevent future challenges to his authority. Selim had himself come to power through a rebellion against his father, and he eliminated his brothers and nephews with a thoroughness that shocked even observers accustomed to the harsh realities of dynastic politics. That Suleiman survived this purge was due partly to luck, partly to his father's recognition that the succession needed to be secured, and partly to his own careful navigation of the treacherous waters of court politics. He learned from these experiences a caution that would characterize his later dealings with the family members, a wariness born of understanding that the greatest threats to a sultan's power often came from those closest to him by blood. The transfer to the governorship of Manisa in 1513 marked Suleiman's emergence as the clear heir apparent to his father's throne. Manisa was traditionally the post given to the prince who was being prepared for the sultanate, and Suleiman's appointment sent a clear signal to the empire that Selim had chosen his successor. The city was located in one of the most prosperous regions of the empire, giving the young governor experience in managing wealthy provinces whose revenues were essential to imperial finances. More importantly, Manisa was close enough to Istanbul that Suleiman could be summoned quickly if needed, but far enough away that he was not directly involved in the intrigues of the capital. The 7 years Suleiman spent as governor of Manisa were crucial to his development as a ruler and as a person. He was now in his 20s, old enough to exercise real authority, but young enough to learn from his mistakes without catastrophic consequences. He built a court that would become a kind of government in waiting, attracting talented administrators, military commanders, and scholars who would later form the core of his imperial administration. He established relationships with the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that formed the backbone of Ottoman military power, earning their respect through a combination of personal courage and attention to their needs and concerns. During these years, Suleiman also developed the cultural and intellectual interests that would distinguish his reign and earn him the epithet the Magnificent in the West and the lawgiver among his own people. He became a serious patron of poetry and architecture, supporting poets who would help create the distinctive Ottoman literary tradition and beginning to dream of the great architectural projects that would one day transform the skyline of Istanbul. He collected books and manuscripts, building a library that reflected the breadth of Islamic learning and demonstrating his commitment to the life of the mind, as well as the arts of war and governance. His personal life during these years also took on the shape that would influence so much of his later reign, as he established relationships with women who would become central figures in the drama of his court. The story of his relationship with Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, would become one of the most famous love stories in Ottoman history, a romance that defied conventions and ultimately reshaped the politics of the empire in ways that no one could have predicted. The news of Sultan Selim's death reached Manisa in September 1520, carried by messengers who had ridden hard across the Anatolian plateau, with word that the empire awaited its new master. Selim had died suddenly at the age of 54, his health broken by the enormous exertions of his 8-year reign. The speed of his passing had prevented the kind of succession crisis that had marked earlier transitions, but it also meant that Suleiman inherited power at a moment of uncertainty, when the empire's recent conquests had not yet been fully consolidated, and when potential enemies, both foreign and domestic, might see the accession of an untested young sultan as an opportunity to challenge Ottoman power. Suleiman's journey from Manisa to Istanbul to claim his inheritance was conducted with the kind of careful ceremony that would characterize his entire approach to rule, as he understood that the manner in which he assumed power would send important signals about the kind of sultan he intended to be. He traveled in state, receiving the homage of the various officials and notables who came out to greet him, demonstrating both his authority and his accessibility in ways that built support while discouraging opposition. The entry into Istanbul was orchestrated as a moment of both continuity and change, as the 26-year-old Sultan took possession of the Topkapi Palace that would be his home and the administrative center of his empire for the rest of his life. The palace, which his great-grandfather Mehmed II had begun building shortly after the conquest of Constantinople, was less a single building than a vast complex of pavilions and courtyards, gardens and audience halls, spread across a promontory overlooking the meeting of the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn. Here, surrounded by the Imperial Council and the vast bureaucracy that administered an empire stretching across 3 continents, Suleiman began the work of consolidating his power and establishing the character of his reign. His first acts as Sultan revealed a shrewd understanding of the political symbolism that would help secure his position, as he released merchants whom his father had imprisoned on dubious charges and restored property that had been confiscated, demonstrating that the new reign would be characterized by justice rather than arbitrary power. These gestures were more than mere propaganda, though they certainly served that purpose. They reflected Suleiman's genuine conviction, developed through years of education and experience, that legitimate authority required more than just force, that a sultan who wished to rule effectively needed to earn the loyalty and respect of his subjects through consistent adherence to principles of justice and law. This commitment to rule-bound governance would become one of the defining characteristics of his reign, and would earn him among his own people the title Kanuni, the lawgiver. The early months of Suleiman's reign were devoted to consolidating his authority and preparing for the military campaigns that everyone understood would be necessary to establish his reputation and deter potential challengers. The Ottoman system required that each new sultan demonstrate his military capabilities early in his reign, both to maintain the empire's momentum of expansion and to prove that he possessed the qualities necessary to lead the Islamic world's most powerful state. The target Suleiman chose for his first campaign revealed both ambition and strategic sophistication, as he set his sights on Belgrade, the great fortress city that controlled the Danube River crossing and served as the key to the Kingdom of Hungary. Belgrade had resisted numerous Ottoman sieges in the past, most famously in 1456, when the Hungarian hero John Hunyadi had inflicted a significant defeat on Mehmed the Conqueror's army. Its capture would open the way for Ottoman expansion into Central Europe and would demonstrate that the new Sultan was worthy of his great ancestors. The army that assembled for the Belgrade campaign in the spring of 1521 was a magnificent display of Ottoman military power, bringing together contingents from across the empire in a force that numbered perhaps 60,000 men. At its core were the Janissaries, those elite infantry whose discipline and firepower had made them legendary throughout Europe. Around them gathered the Sipahi cavalry, feudal horsemen who held lands in return for military service, providing the mobile striking power that had been the foundation of Turkish military success for centuries. Artillery trains brought the heavy guns whose thunderous bombardment could reduce even the strongest fortifications to rubble, while irregular troops provided the manpower for siege works and the pursuit of fleeing enemies. The siege of Belgrade unfolded with the methodical precision that would characterize all of Suleiman's military operations, as trenches were dug and batteries established, supply lines secured, and assault plans developed. The young Sultan personally supervised these operations, demonstrating both his technical understanding of siege warfare and his willingness to share the hardships and dangers of campaign life with his men. This combination of technical competence and personal courage earned him the respect of his soldiers, while his careful attention to logistics and planning prevented the kind of costly mistakes that had doomed earlier Ottoman attempts to take the city. The fall of Belgrade after several weeks of bombardment marked the successful beginning of Suleiman's military career and opened a new chapter in the long struggle between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe. The strategic implications of the victory were immediately apparent to observers on both sides, as the city's capture removed the main barrier to Ottoman expansion into Hungary and the Balkans, threatening the entire defensive system that Christian powers had built to contain Turkish expansion over the previous century. But perhaps equally important was the psychological impact of the victory, as it demonstrated to friend and foe alike that the new Sultan possessed the military abilities and determination necessary to continue the Ottoman tradition of conquest and expansion. The celebrations that greeted news of Belgrade's capture in Istanbul and throughout the empire reflected not just joy at a specific victory, but relief that the dynasty had produced another capable leader who could maintain the momentum of Ottoman power. The following year brought an even more spectacular demonstration of Suleiman's military capabilities, as he turned his attention to Rhodes, the island fortress that had served for over 2 centuries as the headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller, one of the great military orders of medieval Christendom. The Knights, who had been driven from the Holy Land by the Mamluk sultans of Egypt in the early 14th century, had transformed Rhodes into a virtually impregnable stronghold from which they launched raids on Muslim shipping and coastal settlements throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The campaign against Rhodes required a level of logistical and technical sophistication that exceeded anything attempted during the Belgrade siege, as Suleiman had to transport an entire army across the sea and maintain it on a hostile island where every supply had to be shipped from the mainland. The Knights were formidable opponents, heavily armored professional warriors whose fighting skills and defensive engineering had been perfected over centuries of warfare against Muslim powers. Their fortress, strengthened by the latest advances in military architecture, represented the culmination of medieval defensive technology. The siege that began in the summer of 1522 would last for more than 5 months, testing the determination and resources of both sides to their limits. Suleiman's army, which may have numbered as many as 100,000 men at its peak, surrounded the fortress and began the slow, grinding work of reducing its defenses through constant bombardment and repeated assaults. The Turkish artillery, some of the finest in the world, pounded the walls day and night, while sappers dug mines beneath the fortifications in attempts to create breaches that assault troops could exploit. The Knights and the civilian population of Rhodes defended their island with desperate courage, knowing that defeat might mean death or enslavement for many of them. They countermined Turkish tunnels, led sorties against siege works, and repaired breaches almost as quickly as Ottoman guns could create them. But the disparity in resources was simply too great to overcome indefinitely, and by December it was clear that continued resistance would result only in more deaths without changing the ultimate outcome. The negotiations that led to the surrender of Rhodes revealed Suleiman's understanding that victory in war should serve broader political objectives rather than simply satisfying a desire for revenge or conquest. He granted the Knights generous terms, allowing them to depart with their weapons and portable possessions, even providing ships to transport them to Sicily. This magnanimity served several purposes. It demonstrated his power more effectively than massacre could have done. It established his reputation for honor that would make future enemies more willing to negotiate, and it removed an ongoing source of conflict without creating martyrs who might inspire future resistance. The fall of Rhodes eliminated the last significant Christian military presence in the eastern Mediterranean and established Ottoman naval dominance in waters that would remain under Turkish control for centuries. But perhaps more importantly, it demonstrated to European powers that the new Sultan wasn't merely continuing his predecessor's policies, but was elevating Ottoman power to new heights through a combination of military capability, diplomatic skill, and strategic vision that marked him as one of the great rulers of the age. The years following the capture of Rhodes saw Suleiman turn his attention to the internal administration of his empire, beginning the great project of legal codification that would earn him among his own people a reputation that outlasted even his military achievements. The Ottoman legal system, like the empire itself, was a complex hybrid that drew on multiple traditions: Islamic Sharia law, Turkish customary law, Byzantine Roman legal principles, and the Sultan's own legislative authority as the shadow of God on earth. This multiplicity of legal sources had created a situation where uncertainty and inconsistency often characterized the administration of justice, with similar cases sometimes receiving different outcomes depending on which legal framework was applied or which judge was hearing the case. Suleiman undertook to bring order to this chaos through a systematic codification of imperial law that would establish clear principles and procedures while respecting the diversity of traditions that made the Ottoman system function. The legal reforms that Suleiman instituted touched every aspect of life in the empire, from criminal law to property rights, from tax administration to religious endowments, from military organization to commercial regulation. Working with the greatest legal minds of his age, the Sultan created a comprehensive code that provided guidance for judges and administrators while allowing enough flexibility to accommodate the varied circumstances of his diverse subjects. Perhaps most importantly, these legal reforms were not simply imposed from above, but reflected a genuine effort to understand how Ottoman governance actually worked at the local level and to create frameworks that could make it work better. Suleiman traveled extensively throughout his domains during these years, holding court in various cities, receiving petitions directly from his subjects, observing how imperial officials actually performed their duties. These first-hand observations informed the legal reforms in ways that made them more practical and effective than they might otherwise have been. The impact of Suleiman's legal reforms extended far beyond the mere administration of justice, important as that was. By establishing clear, consistent legal frameworks, he created conditions that encouraged economic development and long-distance trade, as merchants could operate with greater confidence that their contracts would be enforced and their property protected. The legal codes also helped to integrate the various communities of the empire more fully into a common system while preserving their right to govern their internal affairs according to their own traditions and beliefs. The period of peace and internal consolidation that followed the Rhodes campaign allowed Suleiman to indulge his passion for architecture, beginning the great building projects that would transform Istanbul and other Ottoman cities in ways that remain visible today. Working with the architect Mimar Sinan, who would become the most famous architect in Ottoman history, Suleiman initiated the construction of mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and caravanserais that combined aesthetic beauty with practical functionality in ways that epitomized the highest achievements of Islamic architecture. The mosques that rose during Suleiman's reign were not merely places of worship, but complex institutional centers that included schools and hospitals, libraries and soup kitchens, markets and public baths. They served as anchors for entire neighborhoods, providing social services and creating spaces where Muslims from all walks of life could gather for prayer and community. The architectural forms that Sinan and other Ottoman architects developed during this period, the great central dome surrounded by semi-domes and punctuated by slender minarets, created buildings that seemed to float above the city, their interiors bathed in soft light, filtered through hundreds of windows. But the true innovation of Ottoman architecture under Suleiman was not simply aesthetic, though the buildings were certainly beautiful, but functional, as these structures were designed to serve the needs of a diverse, growing urban population, while expressing in stone and tile the religious and political values that legitimized Ottoman rule. The public fountains that provided free water to all comers, the covered markets that protected merchants and customers from weather, the bridges that connected different parts of the city and the empire. All of these were expressions of a vision of governance that saw the Sultan's role as providing not just security, but prosperity and comfort for all his subjects. The personal dimension of Suleiman's life during these years was dominated by his relationship with Hurrem Sultan, the woman who would become perhaps the most influential consort in Ottoman history. Hurrem's origins remain somewhat mysterious, though she appears to have been captured in one of the raids that periodically swept through the borderlands between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe, probably from the Ukrainian territories that would later become known as the Cossack lands. She entered the imperial harem as a slave, but her intelligence, beauty, and strength of character quickly brought her to the Sultan's attention. What began as a conventional relationship between a sultan and a concubine gradually evolved into something unprecedented in Ottoman history, as Suleiman developed a genuine emotional attachment to Hurrem that survived and deepened over decades. In a remarkable break with Ottoman tradition, which held that sultans should maintain relationships with multiple women to ensure an abundant supply of potential heirs, Suleiman freed Hurrem from slavery and eventually married her, making her his legal wife and granting her an official status that no concubine could claim. The influence that Hurrem exercised over Suleiman and through him over imperial policy would become legendary and controversial as she involved herself in matters of state in ways that challenged traditional boundaries between the harem and the world of politics and governance. She maintained extensive correspondence with foreign rulers, intervened in matters of succession and government appointments, and generally behaved as a political figure in her own right, rather than simply as the Sultan's consort. This active role would earn her admiration from some observers and fierce criticism from others who saw her influence as a dangerous innovation that violated the proper order of things. The return to military campaigning came in 1526, when Suleiman led a massive army northward into Hungary, responding to provocations from King Louis II and seizing the opportunity to extend Ottoman power deep into Central Europe. The Hungarian kingdom, once one of the strongest powers in the region, had been weakened by internal divisions and by the diversion of resources needed to face the Ottoman threat toward dynastic conflicts with neighboring Christian powers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the political map of Europe and establish the Ottomans as a major player in European affairs for centuries to come. The campaign unfolded with a terrible inevitability as the Ottoman army advanced methodically through the Hungarian plain, brushing aside local resistance and heading toward an inevitable confrontation with the main Hungarian army. King Louis, despite warnings from more experienced commanders, decided to offer battle rather than retreating behind fortifications, where he might have had better chances of survival. The decision would prove fatal, as the Hungarian forces were simply no match for the disciplined, experienced Ottoman army that Suleiman had brought against them. The Battle of Mohacs, fought on August 29, 1526, lasted only a few hours, but had consequences that would echo for centuries, as the Hungarian army was destroyed and King Louis himself was killed, either in the battle or shortly afterward, while attempting to flee across a stream. The victory opened all of Hungary to Ottoman occupation and removed one of the main barriers that had prevented Turkish expansion into Central Europe for generations. Within days of the battle, Ottoman forces were advancing on Buda, the Hungarian capital, which surrendered without significant resistance. The occupation of Hungary created as many problems as it solved, as Suleiman now found himself ruling a Christian population that had no tradition of Ottoman governance and that could look to powerful neighbors for support in resisting Turkish rule. The Habsburg Empire, which was emerging as the dominant power in Central Europe under Emperor Charles V, saw the Ottoman presence in Hungary as an existential threat and was determined to contest it even at the cost of prolonged warfare. The result would be a series of campaigns and counter-campaigns that would consume resources and attention for decades, creating a permanent state of tension along the empire's northwestern frontier. More immediately, the Hungarian campaign demonstrated that Ottoman expansion into Europe faced natural limits that even Suleiman's military genius could not overcome. The distances involved made it difficult to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods, while the different terrain and climate of Central Europe posed challenges that Ottoman forces accustomed to fighting in Anatolia and the Balkans were not always equipped to handle. Most importantly, the solidification of Habsburg power meant that the Ottomans now faced an opponent who could match them in resources and determination, creating a balance of forces that would make decisive victory impossible for either side. The failure of the first siege of Vienna in 1529 underscored these limitations, as Suleiman's army, after advancing deep into Austria and investing the Habsburg capital, found itself unable to breach the city's defences before the onset of winter forced a retreat. The siege had been hampered by logistical problems, as the heavy artillery that might have broken the walls had been unable to keep up with the rapidly advancing army, and by the determined resistance of the Viennese garrison, which was reinforced and resupplied despite Ottoman efforts at blockade. The retreat from Vienna was conducted in good order and did not constitute a military disaster. But it did represent a strategic setback that demonstrated the limits of Ottoman power in Europe. The psychological impact was perhaps as important as the military consequences, as Christian populations that had been overawed by the apparently unstoppable Ottoman advance now understood that the Turkish Sultan could be resisted and even defeated if defenders showed courage and determination. The failure also had domestic political implications, as it raised questions among some elements of the Ottoman elite about whether campaigns so far from home served the empire's interests or simply satisfied the Sultan's personal ambition. Suleiman's response to these setbacks revealed the maturity and strategic sophistication that would characterize his later reign, as he recognized that the conquest of Central Europe might not be achievable given the resources available and the determination of Habsburg resistance. Rather than continuing to pour men and treasure into campaigns that might not succeed, he shifted to a strategy of containing Habsburg power while securing Ottoman control over the territories that had already been conquered. Hungary would remain divided between Ottoman and Habsburg zones of control, with a buffer region governed by client princes who paid tribute to both empires while maintaining a precarious independence. This strategic adjustment allowed Suleiman to turn his attention to other frontiers, where Ottoman interests might be advanced more successfully and at lower cost. The eastern frontier with Safavid Persia had been relatively quiet during the early years of his reign, but by the early 1530s it was becoming clear that Shah Tahmasp was seeking to expand Persian influence in eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia in ways that threatened vital Ottoman interests. The religious dimension of this rivalry added particular intensity to the conflict, as the Safavid dynasty promoted Shia Islam in ways that challenged Ottoman claims to leadership of the Islamic world, and that could potentially create unrest among Ottoman subjects who were attracted to Persian religious teachings. The campaigns against Persia that Suleiman conducted in the 1530s and 1540s were less dramatic than his European wars, but perhaps equally important for the long-term security and prosperity of the empire. The capture of Baghdad in 1534 restored Ottoman control over Mesopotamia and secured the vital trade routes that connected the empire to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean beyond. The occupation of Tabriz, though temporary, demonstrated that Ottoman power could reach into the heart of Persia itself and served as a warning against future Persian interference in Ottoman affairs. These eastern campaigns also revealed a different side of Suleiman's personality and leadership style, as the harsh conditions of warfare in the Anatolian highlands and Mesopotamian deserts tested his physical endurance and mental resilience in ways that European campaigns hadn't. The accounts from this period describe a sultan who shared his soldiers' hardships, who slept in the same tents and ate the same food, who personally reconnoitered enemy positions and visited wounded soldiers in field hospitals. This willingness to endure hardship alongside his men earned him a loyalty and devotion that mere military success alone could not have generated. The domestic political situation during these middle years of Suleiman's reign was increasingly dominated by competition for succession and by the growing influence of Hurrem Sultan over imperial policy. The Sultan's sons by different mothers saw each other as rivals for the throne, creating factions within the court and the military that threatened to tear the empire apart in civil war. The most capable of these sons, Mustafa, was the child of an earlier relationship and enjoyed strong support among the Janissaries and many provincial governors who saw him as his father's natural successor. Hurrem's own sons, Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir, represented a competing claim to the succession, and their mother worked tirelessly to advance their interests while undermining Mustafa's position. The letters and documents from this period reveal a woman of considerable political skill, who understood how to work through informal channels to influence decisions that were formerly the Sultan's alone to make. She cultivated relationships with grand viziers and other officials who could advance her son's interests. She maintained correspondence with foreign rulers whose support might prove useful, and she used her personal influence over Suleiman to shape his perceptions of events and personalities in ways that served her objectives. The tragedy that unfolded from this competition for succession would haunt the remainder of Suleiman's reign and would raise questions about his judgment that persist among historians to this day. In 1553, based on accusations that appear to have been manufactured or at least greatly exaggerated by Hurrem and her allies, Suleiman ordered the execution of Prince Mustafa, his most capable son and the favorite of many to succeed him. The exact circumstances remain murky, with some sources suggesting that Mustafa was indeed plotting to depose his father, while others maintain that he was the victim of a conspiracy by those who feared his accession to power. Whatever the truth of the accusations, the execution of Mustafa was a catastrophic error that deprived the empire of what might have been its greatest future sultan, and that created deep divisions within the Ottoman elite. The Janissaries, who had loved Mustafa and who saw his death as an injustice, became sullen and potentially mutinous, requiring careful management to prevent an outright rebellion. Provincial governors and military commanders who had supported the prince found themselves in precarious positions, uncertain whether their past loyalties would be held against them by a sultan who had shown himself willing to execute his own son on suspicion of disloyalty. The aftermath of Mustafa's execution cast a shadow over what should have been the triumphant later years of Suleiman's reign, as the question of succession remained unresolved and increasingly troubling. The rivalry between Hurrem's surviving sons, Selim and Bayezid, grew more intense, eventually erupting into open warfare in which Bayezid was defeated and fled to Persia seeking asylum. Suleiman, determined to prevent his empire from being torn apart by civil war after his death, eventually secured Bayezid's extradition from the Persian Shah and had him and his sons executed, leaving Selim as the uncontested heir despite widespread doubts about his capabilities. These domestic tragedies occurred against a background of continued military and diplomatic activity on the empire's various frontiers, as Suleiman worked to maintain Ottoman power and prestige despite the advancing years that were gradually sapping his physical strength. The Mediterranean became an increasingly important theatre of Ottoman operations during the 1540s and 1550s, as the empire's navy, led by the capable Admiral Barbarossa and his successors, challenged Habsburg and Venetian control of the sea lanes that connected Europe with the Levant and North Africa. The naval campaigns of this period were characterized by a fluid, mobile warfare very different from the siege operations and set-piece battles that dominated land warfare, as Ottoman and Christian fleets maneuvered for position across the vast expanses of the Mediterranean, seeking to protect their own commerce while disrupting that of their enemies. The galley fleets that both sides deployed were marvels of organization and seamanship, each vessel carrying hundreds of rowers and soldiers in formations that could number dozens or even hundreds of ships, moving across the water like great seaborne armies whose battles were decided as much by endurance and seamanship as by weapons and tactics. The Ottoman naval presence in the Western Mediterranean, based in North African ports like Algiers and Tripoli, created a permanent threat to Spanish and Italian shipping that forced Christian powers to divert substantial resources to naval defense. The raids that Ottoman corsairs launched against Christian coasts brought back both plunder and captives, enriching the raiders while demonstrating that even the heartlands of Christian Europe were vulnerable to Muslim power. These operations served strategic purposes beyond their immediate military or economic impact, as they maintained pressure on the Habsburgs and their allies, while demonstrating that Ottoman power could project itself across great distances to strike at enemies wherever they might be found. The alliance that Suleiman developed with France, the most powerful Catholic kingdom in Western Europe, was one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of his reign and one of the most controversial. The idea of a Christian king allying with the Muslim Sultan against other Christian powers scandalized many Europeans and generated propaganda that portrayed Francis I and his successors as betrayers of Christendom who had sold their souls for political advantage. But from the Ottoman and French perspectives, the alliance made perfect strategic sense, as it allowed both powers to contain Habsburg expansion while pursuing their own distinct objectives in different parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. The practical manifestations of this Franco-Ottoman alliance included coordinated military campaigns, commercial agreements that benefited both parties, and cultural exchanges that would have long-lasting impacts on European perceptions of the Ottoman Empire. French merchants gained privileged access to Ottoman markets through capitulations that gave them special trading rights, while French military advisors and technical experts occasionally served the Sultan in various capacities. Most dramatically, Ottoman fleets sometimes operated from French ports, creating the extraordinary spectacle of Muslim warships using Christian harbors as bases for operations against other Christian powers. The cultural flowering that occurred during the middle decades of Suleiman's reign reflected the prosperity and confidence of an empire at the height of its power, as poets and artists, architects and scholars found generous patronage and conditions conducive to producing their best work. The Sultan himself was an accomplished poet who wrote under the pen name Muhibbi, the lover, producing verses in Turkish and Persian that showed genuine literary skill rather than the merely competent versifying that might be expected from a royal dilettante. His poems often dealt with themes of love and longing, reflecting his continued devotion to Hurrem Sultan and his emotional life in ways that were unusual for a ruler who otherwise maintained the formal dignity expected of an Ottoman sultan. The architectural achievements of this period reached their culmination in the great mosque complexes that Suleiman commissioned throughout his empire, with the crowning glory being the Suleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, begun in 1550 and completed in 1557. The architect Mimar Sinan created in this building perhaps the finest example of Ottoman architecture, a structure that combined the engineering sophistication needed to support a massive central dome with an aesthetic refinement that created interior spaces of extraordinary beauty and serenity. The mosque was surrounded by a complex of supporting buildings, schools and libraries, hospitals and soup kitchens, baths and shops that served the needs of the surrounding neighborhood while demonstrating the Sultan's commitment to providing for the welfare of his subjects. The interior of the Suleymaniye Mosque, with its vast central space flooded with light from hundreds of windows, created an atmosphere that combined the spiritual with the aesthetic in ways that embodied the highest aspirations of Islamic architecture. The calligraphy that decorated the walls reproduced verses from the Quran in scripts of such beauty that they elevated the words themselves into visual art, while the Iznik tiles that adorned certain sections brought color and pattern into harmony with the pure lines of the architectural forms. The acoustics were carefully designed so that the Imam's voice during prayers would carry to every corner of the huge interior without requiring him to shout, creating an intimacy within vastness that made worshippers feel both part of a great community and individually connected to the divine presence. But the Suleymaniye was more than just a magnificent building or even a complex of social services. It was a statement in stone and tile about the nature of Suleiman's rule and his vision of what the Ottoman Empire should be. The mosque stood on one of Istanbul's 7 hills, visible from across the city and from ships approaching through the Bosphorus, a permanent reminder of the Sultan's power and piety. Yet it also served intensely practical purposes, providing education and healthcare, feeding the poor and sheltering travelers, demonstrating that Islamic rule meant not just conquest and glory, but service and compassion for all subjects regardless of their status or wealth. The death of Hurrem Sultan in 1558 marked a turning point in Suleiman's personal life and emotional state, as the woman who had been his companion for nearly 4 decades and who had shaped so much of his domestic policy was suddenly gone, leaving a void that could not be filled. The grief that the Sultan experienced was profound and visible, marking him in ways that observers at court found striking in a man who had always maintained careful control over his public emotions. He visited her tomb frequently, commissioned elaborate Quran recitations in her memory, and according to some accounts, never fully recovered from the loss, becoming more melancholy and withdrawn in his final years. The last decade of Suleiman's life was marked by a gradual physical decline that he fought against with determination but could not ultimately overcome. He suffered from gout that made movement painful, from digestive problems that required careful management of his diet, and from the general weakness that comes with advancing years, especially for someone who had spent so much of his life on military campaigns in harsh conditions. Yet he continued to take an active role in governance, receiving ambassadors and hearing petitions, reviewing military plans and administrative reports, maintaining the routines that had sustained him throughout his long reign. The decision to undertake one final campaign against the Habsburgs in Hungary in 1566 revealed both Suleiman's continued determination to pursue Ottoman interests and perhaps a recognition that his time was running out and that he wanted to die as he had lived, at the head of his armies rather than in the comfortable confinement of the palace. The ostensible reason for the campaign was to support Hungarian allies who were threatened by Habsburg forces, but there may also have been a personal dimension, a desire to end his life in action rather than in slow decline, to go out in a blaze of glory rather than fading away in his bed. The army that assembled for this final campaign was as magnificent as any that Suleiman had led in his youth, a great host that stretched for miles across the landscape as it moved northward from Istanbul toward the Hungarian frontier. But the Sultan who led this army was a shadow of the vital young man who had captured Belgrade 45 years earlier, so weakened by age and illness that he had to be carried in a litter for much of the journey, though he insisted on mounting his horse whenever the army entered towns or when scouts reported that enemy forces were nearby. The siege of Szigetvar, a fortress in southern Hungary that blocked the Ottoman advance toward Vienna, became Suleiman's final battlefield, though he would not live to see its capture. The fortress was defended by Miklos Zrinyi, a Croatian nobleman whose courage and tactical skill made him a formidable opponent despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of the besieging forces. For weeks the siege dragged on, with Ottoman artillery pounding the walls while defenders mounted desperate sorties to disrupt the siege works and buy time for relief forces that never came. Suleiman's condition deteriorated steadily during the siege, as the strain of campaign life and the stress of directing military operations took their toll on a body that was simply too worn out to continue. He knew he was dying, and he used his remaining time to ensure that the transition of power to his son Selim would occur as smoothly as possible, and that the siege would continue until victory was achieved. He met with his viziers and generals, giving final instructions about both immediate military matters and longer-term policy, trying to provide guidance that would help his less capable successor navigate the challenges that awaited him. Death came in the early morning hours of September 7th, 1566, in the Sultan's tent outside the walls of Szigetvar, as the sounds of artillery bombardment and the cries of soldiers drifted through the fabric walls. Those who were present reported that his passing was peaceful, that he seemed to simply stop breathing after reciting verses from the Quran that spoke of the soul's return to its creator. The man who had ruled the Ottoman Empire for 46 years, who had led it to heights of power and magnificence that would never be equaled, who had been called the lawgiver by his own people and the magnificent by his enemies, had completed his journey from the palace of Trabzon to this tent in the Hungarian plain, and now his soul was embarking on the greatest journey of all. The immediate problem facing Suleiman's advisors was how to handle the succession without disrupting the ongoing siege or giving the enemy any opportunity to exploit what might appear to be Ottoman weakness. The solution they devised revealed the sophistication of Ottoman political culture and the loyalty that Suleiman had inspired among his closest associates. The Sultan's death was kept secret from all but a few trusted officials, while messengers rode hard toward Istanbul with word that would summon Prince Selim to take possession of his inheritance. For more than a month, the charade continued, as officials announced that the Sultan was too ill to appear in public, but continued to issue orders in his name. The siege of Styggetvar continued with renewed intensity, and when the fortress finally fell after a desperate final defense in which Zrinyi and most of his garrison died fighting, the victory was announced as having occurred during Suleiman's lifetime, preserving the illusion of continuity. Only after Selim had safely arrived and been proclaimed Sultan was the truth revealed, and even then the announcement was managed in ways that minimized the potential for disruption or challenges to the succession. The body of the great Sultan was prepared for its final journey to Istanbul, with the internal organs buried near the site of his death, while the rest was preserved for transport to the capital, where it would be interred in the mausoleum that had been prepared adjacent to the Süleymaniye Mosque. The funeral procession that carried Suleiman's remains back to Istanbul was a last display of Ottoman ceremony and power, as contingents from all parts of the empire joined in honoring the Sultan who had ruled them for nearly half a century. The interment in the mausoleum at the Süleymaniye brought Suleiman's earthly journey to a close in the architectural masterpiece that was perhaps his greatest lasting achievement. Surrounded by the beauty and serenity that Mimar Sinan had created in stone and tile. The tomb itself was a work of art, decorated with the finest Iznik tiles and with calligraphy that reproduced Quranic verses about the afterlife and God's mercy to the faithful. Here, in the heart of the city that he had loved and adorned, the Sultan would rest, while the empire he had built continued on its course through the turbulent waters of history. The reign of Suleiman's son, Selim II, who became known as Selim the Sot because of his reputation for drinking wine in violation of Islamic law, represented a distinct decline from the glory days of his father's rule. Selim lacked both the military abilities and the administrative skills that had made Suleiman great, preferring to leave governance to his viziers while he indulged in the pleasures of the palace. This pattern of sultan as figurehead, while actual power resided with the Grand Vizier and other officials, would characterize much of later Ottoman history, as the dynasty that had produced such remarkable leaders in its first 2 centuries gradually transformed into something more ceremonial than functional. Yet the institutional structures that Suleiman had created proved remarkably durable, continuing to function effectively even under less capable leadership. The legal codes he had established remained the foundation of Ottoman jurisprudence for centuries. The administrative systems he had refined continued to govern the empire's vast territories with reasonable efficiency, and the military traditions he had maintained kept Ottoman forces formidable despite occasional defeats. The empire that he left to his successors would continue as a great power for another century, and would survive in some form until the aftermath of World War I, a remarkable testament to the strength of the foundations he had laid. The cultural and intellectual achievements of Suleiman's reign had equally lasting impacts, as the architectural traditions established during his rule influenced Ottoman building for generations, while the literary and artistic standards set at his court provided models that later artists and poets would study and emulate. The mosques and bridges, the aqueducts and caravanserais that were built during his reign continued to serve the needs of Ottoman subjects long after his death, while the legal and administrative documents produced by his bureaucracy provided sources for historians and scholars seeking to understand how this remarkable empire actually functioned. The memory of Suleiman himself underwent various transformations as the centuries passed and as different groups sought to claim his legacy for their own purposes. In Turkish nationalist historiography of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he became a symbol of Turkish greatness at a time when the Ottoman Empire was collapsing and new Turkish identities were being forged from its ruins. In Western European historical writing, he was often portrayed as the magnificent but ultimately alien other, a representative of Islamic civilization at its most impressive but also most threatening to Christian Europe. More recent scholarship has sought to understand Suleiman in his own terms, rather than as a symbol for later ideological projects, examining the complex realities of his reign and the multiple factors that contributed to both his successes and his failures. This research has revealed a ruler who was neither the flawless hero of Turkish nationalist mythology nor the threatening barbarian of earlier Western histories, but a sophisticated political operator working within the constraints and opportunities of his particular historical moment, making choices that sometimes succeeded brilliantly and sometimes failed catastrophically, but always with consequences that shaped the world he lived in and the worlds that would come after. The legal reforms that were perhaps Suleiman's most lasting domestic achievement continued to influence Ottoman governance long after his death, providing frameworks that helped the empire adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles of Islamic law and Ottoman tradition. The comprehensive law codes that he had commissioned, which covered everything from criminal procedures to property rights, from tax collection to military organization, remained in force with only gradual modifications until the major reforms of the 19th century. These codes had established principles of governance that emphasized regularity and predictability, the idea that subjects should be able to know in advance what the law required of them and what punishments would follow from violations. This emphasis on legal regularity was not merely an abstract commitment to justice, though it certainly reflected Suleiman's genuine belief that legitimate authority required rule-bound governance. It also served practical purposes, as clear and consistent legal frameworks made the empire easier to administer, encouraged economic activity by providing security for property and contracts, and helped to integrate diverse populations by establishing common standards that applied across religious and ethnic boundaries, while respecting the autonomy of different communities in matters of personal status and religious practice. The military legacy of Suleiman's reign was equally significant, as the organizational and tactical innovations that had made Ottoman armies so formidable in his day continued to influence military thinking long after the specific circumstances that had made them effective had changed. The combination of disciplined infantry and mobile cavalry, of heavy artillery and light firearms, of siege expertise and open-field battle tactics that had characterized Ottoman military operations under Suleiman became a model that later commanders sought to emulate, even as changing technology and evolving strategic circumstances required adaptations. But perhaps more important than any specific military techniques was the tradition of professionalism and discipline that Suleiman had maintained in Ottoman armed forces, the understanding that military success required not just individual courage, but systematic training, careful planning, adequate logistics, and consistent application of proven methods. This military professionalism, embodied in institutions like the Janissary Corps and the Sipahi cavalry, helped the Ottomans remain competitive with European powers for much longer than they might otherwise have managed, as organizational advantages could partially compensate for technological gaps that were opening up as European military innovation accelerated in the 17th and 18th centuries. The architectural legacy of Suleiman's reign remained perhaps the most visible and enduring of all his achievements, as the great mosques and other buildings constructed during his rule continued to dominate the skylines of Istanbul and other Ottoman cities, serving not just as places of worship or practical facilities, but as permanent reminders of what the empire had been at the height of its power and confidence. The Suleymaniye Mosque, in particular, became an icon of Ottoman architecture, studied by architects and admired by visitors from around the world, its soaring dome and elegant minarets creating a silhouette that seemed to capture in stone and mortar the aspirations and achievements of an entire civilization. But Suleiman's architectural legacy extended far beyond the capital, as mosques and bridges, aqueducts and fortifications built during his reign could be found throughout the empire's vast territories, from the Balkans to Mesopotamia, from the Crimea to Egypt. Each of these structures served practical purposes, while also making aesthetic and political statements about the nature of Ottoman rule and the benefits it could bring to subject populations. A bridge that shortened travel time between important cities, an aqueduct that brought fresh water to a growing town, a caravanserai that provided shelter for merchants traveling dangerous routes. Each of these was both a useful facility and a demonstration that Ottoman governance meant more than just tax collection and military conscription. The commercial prosperity that characterized much of Suleiman's reign was built on foundations of legal security, infrastructure investment, and diplomatic relationships that created conditions favorable to long-distance trade and economic development. The Ottoman Empire occupied a crucial position astride the trade routes connecting Europe with Asia, and Suleiman's policies sought to maximize the benefits that this position could provide, while managing the complex relationships with trading partners who were often also political or military rivals. The capitulations that Suleiman granted to various European powers, giving their merchants special privileges to trade in Ottoman territories, were often seen by later observers as signs of weakness or mistakes that gave away Ottoman advantages for inadequate returns. But in Suleiman's time, these agreements served important purposes, as they encouraged trade that benefited Ottoman subjects as well as foreign merchants, provided diplomatic channels that could be used to manage conflicts short of war, and demonstrated the Sultan's power and magnanimity in ways that enhanced Ottoman prestige. The revenues that flowed into the Ottoman treasury from customs duties and commercial taxes helped to fund the military campaigns and building projects that were such prominent features of Suleiman's reign, while the goods that flowed through Ottoman markets, silks and spices, coffee and cotton, precious metals and manufactured items from across the known world, raised living standards and created employment opportunities for Ottoman subjects engaged in trade, transport, and production. The prosperity that this commercial activity generated was not evenly distributed, as some regions and social groups benefited much more than others, but it did create conditions in which the empire's diverse populations could generally see advantage in maintaining rather than resisting Ottoman rule. The religious and cultural policies that Suleiman pursued throughout his reign reflected a sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in governing a multi-religious empire where the ruling dynasty and military elite were Muslim, but where large populations of Christians and Jews played crucial economic and social roles. The millet system, which allowed different religious communities to govern their own internal affairs according to their own laws and under their own leaders, created a framework for managing diversity that was remarkably tolerant by the standards of the 16th century. This tolerance was not based primarily on modern concepts of religious freedom or human rights, but on pragmatic recognition that attempting to convert or suppress the empire's non-Muslim populations would be both impractical and counterproductive. The various Christian and Jewish communities provided skills and services that were valuable to the empire. They paid taxes that contributed to imperial revenues, and their presence demonstrated that Ottoman rule could accommodate diversity in ways that enhanced rather than threatened imperial power and stability. By allowing these communities to maintain their distinct identities and practices while participating in the broader imperial system, Suleiman's policies created a form of pluralism that would be studied and sometimes admired by later observers seeking to understand how diverse populations could coexist peacefully under a single political authority. The succession crisis that had dominated so much of the later years of Suleiman's reign, culminating in the executions of Princes Mustafa and Bayezid, cast a long shadow over his legacy and raised difficult questions about the wisdom of his personal judgment when family dynamics and political calculations became entangled. The Ottoman system of succession, which allowed any male member of the dynasty to claim the throne, and which typically resulted in the victor executing his brothers and nephews to prevent future challenges, created incentives for exactly the kind of conspiracy and counter-conspiracy that had led to such tragic outcomes. Suleiman's handling of these succession issues revealed both the strengths and limitations of his political skills, as he proved unable to find a solution that could preserve both his authority and the lives of his talented sons. The decision to execute Mustafa, based on accusations that may have been manufactured by rivals seeking to eliminate a dangerous competitor, deprived the empire of what might have been its greatest future ruler, and created lasting resentment among the Janissaries and others who had supported the prince. The subsequent civil war between Selim and Bayezid, which ended with another series of executions that wiped out an entire branch of the dynasty, further demonstrated the costs of a succession system that encouraged fratricide and that made stable transitions of power almost impossible to achieve. These personal tragedies were compounded by the role that Hurrem Sultan played in shaping Suleiman's perceptions and decisions regarding the succession, as her determination to advance her own son's interests may have contributed to misjudgments that had catastrophic consequences. The influence that a sultan's consort could exercise over imperial policy was not unprecedented in Ottoman history, but the extent of Hurrem's involvement in political matters and the tragic outcomes that resulted raised questions about whether the traditional boundaries between the harem and the world of politics should be maintained more strictly to prevent similar problems in the future. Yet despite these personal and dynastic tragedies, the overall trajectory of Suleiman's reign remained one of extraordinary achievement and lasting influence as he presided over the transformation of the Ottoman Empire from a regional power into a truly global empire that shaped events across 3 continents. The territorial expansion that occurred during his reign brought vast new regions under Ottoman control, extending the empire's reach into Central Europe, consolidating its position in the Middle East, and establishing a naval presence in the Mediterranean that would last for centuries. More importantly, Suleiman transformed the very nature of Ottoman governance, creating legal and administrative systems that could manage this vastly expanded empire while maintaining the flexibility needed to accommodate diverse populations and changing circumstances. The law codes he established, the institutions he created or reformed, and the precedents he set through his personal conduct all helped to define what it meant to be an Ottoman and what the empire stood for in a world of competing powers and civilizations. The cultural achievements of Suleiman's era, the architectural masterpieces, the literary works, the artistic innovations, represented more than just aesthetic accomplishments, important as those were. They demonstrated that Islamic civilization could still produce works of lasting value that could rival anything being created in Christian Europe or anywhere else in the world. At a time when European Renaissance was flowering, and when European powers were beginning the process of global exploration and expansion that would eventually make them dominant, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman showed that the Islamic world could still compete and even excel in the arts of both war and peace. The diplomatic relationships that Suleiman established or maintained with powers across the known world, from France and Venice to Persia and the Mughal Empire, demonstrated that the Ottomans were not just a military power, but a sophisticated state capable of pursuing its interests through negotiation and alliance as well as through conquest. The diplomatic correspondence from Suleiman's reign reveals a ruler who understood the importance of prestige and reputation in international relations, who carefully managed the symbolism of diplomatic exchanges, and who recognized that military power alone was not sufficient to achieve all of his objectives. The example that Suleiman set through his personal conduct his commitment to justice, his patronage of learning and the arts, his willingness to share hardships with his soldiers on campaign, his devotion to both religious duties and administrative responsibilities provided a model of what a sultan should be that influenced Ottoman political culture for generations. The fact that few of his successors measured up to this standard does not diminish the importance of the ideal that he embodied, as the memory of his reign continued to provide a benchmark against which later sultans would be judged and often found wanting. As the 17th century dawned and the Ottoman Empire began to face new challenges from increasingly powerful European rivals, from internal administrative problems, and from economic changes that were shifting the global balance of power, the memory of Suleiman's reign took on new significance as a golden age to which nostalgic observers looked back with longing. The reforms that various sultans and viziers attempted to implement were often justified by reference to the need to restore the principles and practices that had made the empire great under Suleiman, even as circumstances had changed in ways that made simple restoration impossible. This idealization of Suleiman's reign sometimes obscured the real problems and limitations that had existed even at the height of Ottoman power, creating a mythologized past that bore only partial resemblance to historical reality. But the myth itself had real consequences, as it shaped how Ottomans thought about their empire and its place in the world, providing both inspiration for reform efforts and sometimes an obstacle to innovations that departed too radically from imagined traditions. The gradual decline of Ottoman power that became increasingly evident in the 17th and 18th centuries as the empire lost territories to European rivals and struggled to maintain its political and military effectiveness, made Suleiman's achievements appear even more impressive in retrospect. The sultans of later generations operated under constraints that Suleiman had not faced: more formidable enemies, more complex international situations, economic and technological changes that were shifting advantages toward European powers. But comparisons with the achievements of the Magnificent Sultan remained inevitable and usually unfavorable to his successors. The ultimate collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of World War I and the emergence of the Turkish Republic from its ruins under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk marked a decisive break with the Ottoman past that required new ways of thinking about figures like Suleiman and what they represented. In the nationalist historiography of the early Turkish Republic, Ottoman sultans were often viewed with ambivalence as representatives of a religious and imperial tradition that the new secular nationalist state was seeking to transcend, yet also as symbols of Turkish greatness at a time when Turkish identity was being reconstructed on new foundations. Suleiman's role in this nationalist narrative was complex, as he could be celebrated as a great Turkish leader who had expanded Turkish power and prestige, but his commitment to Islamic law and his identity as an Ottoman, rather than specifically Turkish ruler, created tensions with the secular nationalist ideology of the Republic. Over time, as Turkish nationalism evolved and as the relationship between modern Turkey and its Ottoman past became less contentious, it became possible to appreciate Suleiman's achievements in more nuanced ways that recognized both their historical significance and their distance from contemporary concerns and values. In the broader Islamic world, Suleiman's legacy remained powerful as a symbol of what Islamic civilization had achieved at its height, and as a reminder that Muslims had once led the world in power, prosperity, and cultural achievement. For populations struggling with colonialism, underdevelopment, and the challenges of modernization, the memory of Suleiman's reign provided both inspiration and sometimes an idealized past that complicated efforts to deal with present realities. The temptation to imagine that restoring some imagined golden age of Islamic governance could solve contemporary problems sometimes obscured the ways in which Suleiman's world was fundamentally different from the modern world, and the extent to which his solutions to his era's challenges might not translate to very different circumstances. In Western historiography, Suleiman's reputation evolved from the magnificent but threatening Turkish Sultan of Renaissance and early modern European sources to a more complex figure whose achievements could be appreciated in their own terms, rather than simply as threats to Christian Europe. The growth of Ottoman studies as an academic field in the 20th century, based on careful study of Ottoman sources and seeking to understand the empire from Ottoman perspectives rather than simply through European eyes, revealed the sophistication of Ottoman governance and the achievements of rulers like Suleiman in ways that earlier, more polemical accounts had obscured. This more balanced historiography has revealed Suleiman as a ruler who was neither the hero of nationalist mythology nor the barbarian of European propaganda, but a complex political figure operating within the constraints and opportunities of his time, making choices that reflected both personal qualities and broader historical forces. The legal reforms, architectural projects, military campaigns, and diplomatic initiatives that characterized his reign can be understood as responses to specific challenges and opportunities, rather than as manifestations of some essential Turkish or Islamic character, allowing for more nuanced appreciation of both achievements and limitations. The question of how to evaluate Suleiman's overall legacy remains contested, as different observers emphasize different aspects of his reign depending on their values and concerns. Those who emphasize military achievements and territorial expansion can point to the significant growth of Ottoman power under his rule and the successful resistance to European encroachment that his policies enabled. Those more concerned with cultural and intellectual achievements can celebrate the architectural masterpieces and literary works that flourished under his patronage and that continue to inspire admiration centuries later. Critics can point to the succession tragedies that marred his later years, to the limits of Ottoman expansion that became apparent despite military successes, to the growing gap between Ottoman and European economic and technological development that would eventually prove fatal to the empire's independence. They can question whether the legal reforms that earned him the title of lawgiver were truly innovative or simply codifications of existing practices, whether the architectural achievements represented genuine artistic breakthroughs or simply skilled application of established traditions, whether the military victories were products of his personal genius or the natural results of the Ottoman system at its peak of effectiveness. What seems clear from the perspective of more than 4.5 centuries after his death is that Suleiman presided over a crucial period in Ottoman and world history. a moment when the empire reached heights of power and cultural achievement that would never be equaled, but also when the limits of that power and the challenges that would eventually undermine it were beginning to become apparent. The reign that began with such promise and optimism, with the capture of Belgrade and Rhodes, with legal reforms and architectural masterpieces, ended with succession tragedies and the intimation of mortality at the siege of Sigetvar, encapsulating the mixture of triumph and tragedy that characterizes so much of human history. The sun was beginning to set over the Bosphorus, painting the waters in shades of gold and amber that had illuminated this strategic waterway since before recorded history began, casting long shadows from the minarets of the Suleimania Mosque that reached across the city like fingers pointing toward some distant horizon. In the gardens of the Topkapi Palace, where generations of Ottoman sultans had contemplated the responsibilities and privileges of power, the fountains continued their eternal song, a reminder that water flows onward regardless of the rise and fall of empires, that beauty persists even as the humans who create it pass into memory and then into history, and finally into legend. Somewhere in those gardens, if you listened very carefully in the quiet moments between the call to evening prayer and the sounds of the city preparing for night, you might hear echoes of footsteps that once walked these paths in thought and planning, in triumph and regret, in youth and age. The man who had been known to his own people as Kanuni, the lawgiver, who had been called the Magnificent by enemies who respected even as they feared him, who had ruled the Ottoman Empire for nearly half a century and shaped its destiny in ways that would echo across centuries, had found in these quiet spaces both the burdens and satisfactions of power, both the loneliness of supreme authority and the companionship of those who shared his journey. The light continued to fade now, touching the domes of mosques and the walls of ancient churches, illuminating for a few moments longer the bridges that connected Europe and Asia across waters that had witnessed the passage of armies and ideas, of merchants and pilgrims, of all the human traffic that had made Istanbul one of the great crossroads of civilization. It spread across the Sea of Marmara toward the distant plains of Thrace, warming the hills where Byzantine emperors had once watched their empire slowly crumble, touching the shores where Ottoman power had begun its rise from obscure origins to world historical significance. And as that golden light slowly gave way to the purple twilight that precedes the night, as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky above the city of sultans and emperors, of poets and architects, of all those who had contributed their gifts to the great work of civilization, the memory of Suleiman's reign seemed to hover in that transitional moment between day and night, between past and present, between history and memory. The magnificence that he had embodied and promoted, the laws he had codified, the buildings he had commissioned, the campaigns he had led, all of these had become part of the great stream of human achievement that flows through time, nourishing the present and inspiring the future, even as the specific circumstances that produced them recede into the past. The call to evening prayer began to echo from the minarets, joining voices across the city in the ancient words that connected this moment with all the moments when Muslims had turned toward Mecca in submission and devotion, creating a bridge across time that made the past present and the distant near. In that call, those who listened with understanding could hear echoes of all the prayers that Suleiman had offered during his long life, his pleas for guidance in making decisions that would affect millions, his gratitude for victories granted and dangers averted, his hopes for a world in which justice and mercy could triumph over tyranny and cruelty. The darkness settled gently over the city now, softening the outlines of buildings and erasing the details that gave them individual character, transforming the skyline into a silhouette of domes and minarets that seemed to float between earth and heaven. The lights that began to appear in windows and shops, along streets and in courtyards, created new constellations that mirrored the stars above, as if the city itself were reaching up to join the celestial sphere in a union of the earthly and the divine. And in that peaceful darkness, where the cares and struggles of the day gave way to the rest that all living things require, where the boundaries between past and present became fluid and permeable, the spirit of the great Sultan seemed to find at last the peace that had eluded him so often during his turbulent life. The magnificent reign was over, the campaigns were ended, the laws were codified, the mosques were built. What remained was memory and legacy, influence and inspiration, the knowledge that one human life lived with purpose and passion, with wisdom and courage, with faith and love, could shape the world in ways that would endure long after the individual had returned to the earth from which all life springs. The night deepened, wrapping Istanbul in a gentle embrace that honored both its glories and its sorrows, its achievements and its failures, all the complex realities that make up the lived experience of any great city that has witnessed the passage of empires and the succession of rulers across the centuries. And somewhere in that darkness, in the silence between the prayers and the dreams, between the memories of what had been and the possibilities of what might yet be, the legacy of Suleiman the Magnificent continued its journey through time, inspiring new generations to believe that greatness was possible, that human beings could rise above their limitations to create works of lasting beauty and significance, that power could be wedded to justice and ambition, to service in ways that enriched the human story and honored the divine spark that animated all creation. The stars wheeled slowly overhead in their eternal patterns, marking time according to celestial rhythms that transcended human concerns and human history, reminding all who gazed upon them that individual lives and even entire civilizations were but brief moments in the vast sweep of cosmic time. Yet those brief moments mattered, for they contained all the joys and sorrows, all the achievements and failures, all the love and loss that gave meaning to existence, and that made the human journey worth undertaking despite its inevitable end. The moon rose over the Golden Horn, its silver light reflecting off the water in shimmering paths that seemed to lead toward some distant, unreachable destination, illuminating the boats that rocked gently at anchor and the walls that had protected the city through so many sieges and threats. This was the same moon that had witnessed Suleiman's birth in Trabzon, that had watched his rise to power and his years of glory, that had looked down on battlefields where men fought and died for causes they believed transcended their individual lives. The same moon that would continue to rise and set long after the last traces of Ottoman civilization had disappeared, a reminder of continuities that persisted beneath all the changes and transformations that marked human history. In the mausoleum at the Suleymaniye, where Suleiman's earthly remains rested in their stone sarcophagus, the moonlight filtered through windows of colored glass, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted subtly as the night progressed. The Iznik tiles that decorated the walls glowed softly in this gentle illumination, their intricate patterns of flowers and vines seeming almost alive in the dancing light. The calligraphy that reproduced Quranic verses about death and resurrection, about divine mercy and human accountability, stood out in bold relief, reminding visitors that this place was not an ending, but a transition, that the soul that had once animated the body buried here had moved on to realms beyond human understanding. The silence in the mausoleum was profound, but not oppressive, filled with a sense of peace that came from completion rather than from emptiness. Here rested a man who had lived fully, who had exercised power with both strength and restraint, who had built monuments that would outlast his memory, who had shaped history in ways that would influence generations yet unborn. The smallness of the tomb compared to the grandeur of the mosque that surrounded it seemed appropriate, a reminder that all human achievement, however magnificent, eventually reduced to dust and memory, that the soul's journey was more important than any earthly accomplishment. The night birds that nested in the mosque's courtyard sang their mysterious songs, creating a natural counterpoint to the human-made architecture that rose above them. Their calls echoed off the stone walls and domes, creating harmonics that seemed almost deliberately musical, as if nature itself were joining in the celebration of what had been created here. These birds knew nothing of sultans or empires, of military campaigns or legal reforms, yet their presence added something essential to the space, a reminder that all human constructions existed within larger natural contexts that preceded them and would outlast them. The gardens that surrounded the Suleymaniye complex were at their most beautiful in the moonlight, with flowers and shrubs creating patterns of light and shadow that changed with each passing cloud, each shift in the angle of illumination. The fountains that Suleiman had commissioned to provide both practical water supplies and aesthetic pleasure continued their eternal music, the sound of falling water, creating a sense of peace and continuity that connected this moment with all the moments since the complex's completion centuries before. In these gardens, Ottoman courtiers had walked and plotted, lovers had met in secret, scholars had debated fine points of law and theology, and ordinary people had simply rested for a few moments in spaces of beauty and calm. The view from the Suleymaniye's terrace, where visitors could look out across the Golden Horn towards the hills of Galata and Pera, was breathtaking in the moonlight as the city spread out below, like a map drawn in silver and shadow. The other great mosques of Istanbul, the Blue Mosque, the Hagia Sophia, the Fatih Mosque, rose at various points across the cityscape, their domes and minarets creating a rhythm of forms that gave coherence and beauty to the urban landscape. These buildings were Suleiman's rivals and successors in the art of mosque construction, each representing different aesthetic choices and different moments in Ottoman architectural development. Yet all were, in some sense, his children. products of the tradition that he had done so much to establish and refine. The Bosphorus itself, that crucial waterway that connected the Black Sea with the Mediterranean, that divided Europe from Asia while also joining them in commerce and culture, flowed onward in the moonlight with the same steady current that had carried Byzantine triremes and Ottoman galleys, merchant ships from Venice, and war fleets from Genoa. The strategic importance that had made Istanbul such a crucial city for millennium after millennium remained evident even in this peaceful nocturnal scene, as the narrow strait represented both opportunity and vulnerability, both a highway for trade and a potential invasion route for enemies. Across the water in the Asian districts of the city, in neighborhoods that had been developed during Suleiman's reign as the city's population grew and spread beyond its ancient boundaries, families were settling in for the night, children being tucked into bed with stories and songs, adults completing their evening prayers and preparing for sleep. These ordinary people, whose names would never be recorded in history books, whose individual stories would be forgotten within a generation or two, were in many ways the true inheritors of Suleiman's legacy, living in the city he had beautified, governed by laws he had codified, drawing water from aqueducts he had built, worshipping in mosques he had commissioned. The relationship between a great ruler and the ordinary subjects whose lives were affected by his decisions was always complex and often ambiguous, as policies that seemed wise and beneficial from the perspective of the palace might create hardship and suffering when implemented in distant provinces by officials more concerned with their own interests than with justice or mercy. Suleiman had been more conscientious than most rulers in trying to ensure that his officials governed justly and that his subjects received the benefits that his laws promised. But the gap between intention and implementation remained, as it always had and always would in any large bureaucratic system. Yet for all these limitations and failures, the overall impact of Suleiman's reign on the lives of ordinary Ottoman subjects had been largely positive, as the legal reforms created more predictability and security. The architectural projects provided employment and public amenities. The military campaigns secured borders and created conditions for commerce to flourish. The prosperity that characterized much of his reign had filtered down through social hierarchies in ways that improved living standards for populations who measured well-being in terms of sufficient food, adequate shelter, and security from violence and arbitrary authority. The merchants who had profited from the expansion of trade under Suleiman's rule, the craftsmen whose skills had been employed in his building projects, the scholars and poets who had found patronage at his court, the soldiers who had served in his armies and shared in the spoils of victory. All of these had benefited in concrete, measurable ways from the policies and priorities that he had established. Even those who had opposed him, whether Christian knights who had fought against Ottoman expansion or Persian soldiers who had defended their homeland against Turkish invasion, had often come to respect him as a worthy opponent who fought with honor and who treated defeated enemies with a magnanimity that was rare in the brutal world of 16th century warfare. The diplomatic correspondence from Suleiman's reign, preserved in archives in Istanbul and in various European capitals, revealed the extent to which he had been regarded by his contemporaries as one of the great rulers of the age, someone whose opinions mattered and whose friendship or enmity could determine the fates of kingdoms and empires. The letters he received from European monarchs, from Persian shahs, from Mughal emperors and Mamluk sultans showed the respect and sometimes fear that Ottoman power inspired, but also the recognition that Suleiman personally was someone who could be negotiated with, who kept his word, who understood the complexities of international relations, and who could be trusted to act in ways that were rational and predictable even when they were opposed to one's interests. This reputation for honorable dealing, established through decades of consistent behavior, had been one of Suleiman's most valuable assets in pursuing Ottoman interests through diplomacy as well as warfare. Enemies who might have been willing to violate truces or break treaties if they thought they could gain advantage were more cautious about doing so when they knew that Suleiman would remember and that future negotiations would be colored by past betrayals. Allies who might have hedged their commitments or sought to play both sides were more likely to remain loyal when they understood that Ottoman support was reliable and that Ottoman displeasure could be dangerous. The religious dimension of Suleiman's legacy remained perhaps the most complex and contested aspect of his historical significance, as different communities and traditions evaluated his reign according to their own values and concerns. For Sunni Muslims, particularly those who followed Ottoman traditions of Islamic practice, Suleiman represented an ideal of what a Muslim ruler should be: pious and just, strong in defense of the faith, but tolerant of other religious communities, committed to implementing Islamic law while recognizing the need for flexibility in application. His title as Servant of the Two Holy Cities, earned through Ottoman protection of Mecca and Medina, gave him a legitimacy in the Islamic world that transcended his role as merely another temporal ruler. For Shia Muslims, particularly in Persia, where the Safavid dynasty promoted a form of Islam that the Ottomans considered heretical, Suleiman's legacy was more ambiguous. The campaigns he had conducted against Persia, justified by religious as well as strategic considerations, had caused suffering and destruction that Shia populations remembered with bitterness. Yet even among Persians, there was often grudging respect for Suleiman's personal qualities and recognition that the Ottoman-Persian rivalry was as much about power and territory as about religious doctrine, that the conflicts between the two empires would have occurred regardless of sectarian differences. For Christians, both those who lived under Ottoman rule and those in independent European states, Suleiman represented different things depending on their specific experiences and perspectives. Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire, particularly those in the Balkans and Anatolia who had lived under Turkish rule for generations, often found Suleiman's reign to be a time of relative prosperity and security, when the legal protections that the millet system provided were generally respected, and when economic opportunities allowed enterprising individuals to achieve success regardless of their religious affiliation. The Greek, Armenian, and Slavic Christians who served as merchants, craftsmen, and professionals in Ottoman cities during Suleiman's reign generally prospered, even as they maintained their distinct religious identities and communities. For Christians in independent European states, particularly those along the Ottoman frontier or within reach of Turkish naval raids, Suleiman was primarily a threat, the leader of a powerful empire that seemed bent on conquest and that had already absorbed substantial territories that had once been part of Christendom. The fear that Ottoman expansion inspired in places like Austria and Italy, Spain, and the Italian states was genuine and well-founded, based on concrete experiences of warfare and on awareness of what Ottoman conquest might mean for Christian populations. Yet even among these fearful enemies, Suleiman's personal reputation for honor and his relatively merciful treatment of defeated opponents earned him respect that tempered the fear and hatred that military conflict naturally generated. The Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire had particular reason to remember Suleiman's reign with gratitude, as the policies of religious tolerance that he maintained, and in some cases expanded, had made the Ottoman lands a refuge for Jews fleeing persecution in Christian Europe. The Spanish Jews who had been expelled by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492 had found new homes in Ottoman cities where they could practice their religion openly and where their skills as merchants, physicians, and craftsmen were valued and rewarded. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman was not free of anti-Jewish prejudice or occasional discrimination, but compared to the alternative of remaining in Christian Europe, where periodic pogroms and expulsions made life precarious, Ottoman rule represented a considerable improvement. This pattern of different communities evaluating Suleiman's legacy according to their own experiences and values illustrated a broader truth about historical memory: that great figures are never simply heroes or villains, but complex individuals whose actions affected different people in different ways. The attempt to arrive at a single, definitive judgment on whether Suleiman was good or bad was probably misguided, as such simple categories could not capture the full complexity of a long reign that included both achievements and failures, both wisdom and folly, both compassion and cruelty. What could be said with confidence was that Suleiman had been one of the most significant rulers of the 16th century, a period when the modern world was taking shape through processes of exploration and conquest, religious reformation and political centralization, cultural flowering and intellectual ferment. His reign had coincided with those of other great rulers: Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, Francis I of France, Henry VIII of England, Shah Tahmasp of Persia. And he had more than held his own in the complex diplomatic and military competitions that characterized the age. The Ottoman Empire that he left to his successors was larger, richer, and more powerful than the one he had inherited, with institutions and traditions that would sustain it through centuries of subsequent challenges. The cultural achievements of his reign had enriched not just Ottoman civilization, but the broader human heritage, as the architectural masterpieces he commissioned and the literary works he patronized represented accomplishments that transcended their specific time and place to speak to universal human aspirations and values. The Suleymaniye Mosque and the other great buildings constructed during his era continued to inspire architects and artists centuries later, demonstrating that great architecture could combine aesthetic beauty with functional purpose in ways that enhanced human life while expressing spiritual and political values. The legal reforms that had earned him his Turkish epithet of Kanuni, the lawgiver, had created frameworks for governance that made the Ottoman Empire more efficient and more just, even if the gap between legal ideals and actual practice remained significant. The principle that legitimate authority required adherence to established laws and procedures, that subjects should be able to know in advance what was expected of them and what consequences would follow from their actions, represented an important advance in political thinking that would influence legal development not just in the Ottoman Empire, but in other contexts as well. The military achievements that had made him the Magnificent in Western eyes had demonstrated that Islamic civilization could still produce leaders capable of challenging Christian Europe on its own terms, that the era of easy Christian expansion at Muslim expense was over, that any future relationships between the two civilizations would have to be based on mutual respect rather than on assumptions of European superiority. The battles he fought and the territories he conquered had secured Ottoman power for generations and had established a balance of forces in the eastern Mediterranean that would persist into the modern era. But perhaps more important than any specific achievement was the example that Suleiman had provided of what leadership could mean, of how power could be exercised in ways that combined strength with justice, ambition with responsibility, success with humility before divine authority. The image of the Sultan who could lead armies in battle and then spend evenings composing poetry, who could order the execution of his own sons when he believed the empire's security required it, and then mourn their loss with genuine grief, who could build magnificent mosques while also ensuring that ordinary subjects had access to clean water and basic education. This complex, multifaceted image of leadership provided a model that continued to resonate long after the specific circumstances that had produced it had passed into history. The dawn was beginning to break now over Istanbul as the eastern sky slowly transformed from black to deep blue to lighter shades that promised the return of day. The stars that had seemed so bright in the darkness began to fade as the sun's approach made itself felt, though the brightest planets remained visible for a while longer, hanging like jewels against the lightening sky. The moon, which had illuminated the night's contemplations, was setting in the west, its silver light giving way to the gold of the rising sun. The call to morning prayer began to echo from the minarets, starting with the mosques nearest the rising sun and spreading across the city in a wave of sound that welcomed the new day. In the Suleymaniye complex, the muezzin climbed the narrow stairs of the minaret to issue his call from the balcony high above the city, his voice carrying across the rooftops and streets, summoning the faithful to begin another day with acknowledgement of divine sovereignty and human dependence. This call, which had been issued from this same spot every morning since the mosque's completion, connected this moment with all the mornings that had come before, creating a continuity that transcended individual lives and that bound together generations in a shared practice of devotion. The light continued to spread across the city, touching first the highest points, the domes and minarets that reached toward heaven, and then flowing down into the streets and courtyards, the gardens and markets, all the spaces where human life would soon resume its daily rhythms. The Bosphorus, which had been silver in the moonlight, now became a sheet of gold in the early morning sun, its surface reflecting the sky's colors in constantly shifting patterns as small waves and currents created textures that caught and scattered the light. In the gardens of the Topkapi Palace, where Ottoman sultans had walked for centuries, where Suleiman had spent so many hours in contemplation and planning, the flowers were beginning to open with the sun's warmth, releasing fragrances that mingled with the scent of the sea and the city's morning cooking fires. The fountain that had witnessed so many imperial conversations and decisions continued its eternal song, the water sparkling in the new light like liquid diamonds, creating rainbows in the mist that rose from its basin. And somewhere in the silence between the last notes of the call to prayer and the first stirrings of the city's daily life, in that liminal moment when night gave way to day and sleep gave way to waking, the spirit of Suleiman the Magnificent seemed to hover over the city he had loved and served, blessing the continuation of life in all its complexity and beauty, watching over the monuments he had built and the legacy he had created, finding peace in the knowledge that his work had been completed and that the empire he had shepherded through its greatest period of power and prosperity would continue its journey through history, carrying forward the values and achievements that he had done so much to establish. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of night's mystery, bringing with it the clarity and specificity of day, when things could be seen clearly and named precisely, when the work of the world could resume. The city came fully alive now, with merchants opening their shops, craftsmen beginning their work, students heading to madrasas, officials making their way to courts and government offices, all the ordinary business of life in a great city that had seen empires rise and fall, yet continued to thrive through all transformations. And in that moment of transition between darkness and light, between memory and present reality, between the past that had been shaped by giants like Suleiman and the future that remained unwritten, the eternal promise of the dawn seemed to speak of continuity and change, of endings that were also beginnings, of human achievement that transcended individual mortality to become part of the great ongoing story of civilization itself. The Sultan at dawn had completed his journey, but the dawn itself was eternal, painting each new day with colors of gold and promise, reminding all who witnessed its beauty that life continued, that history flowed onward like the Bosphorus beneath the city's bridges, and that the achievements of one generation became the foundation for the aspirations of the next, in an endless cycle of creation and renewal that was itself, perhaps, the greatest achievement of all.